Hi, everyone. Well, welcome to this Endpoints webinar session titled Strategic Solutions for Cost, Time, and Quality Challenges in Drug Development. I'm your moderator, Surani Fernando, and this webinar is sponsored by Cambrex. Joining us on the panel, we have three excellent guests, starting with Matthew Bio, Chief Scientific Officer at Cambrex and President at Snapdragon Chemistry, Dan Bowles, VP and General Manager at Cambrex High Point, and Derek Koops, VP and General Manager at Cambrex Longmont. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. This webinar will be recorded and it will be available tomorrow to rewatch or to share with colleagues. There will also be some time at the end for questions. So at any time during the webinar, please hit the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to send through your question. And yeah, let's get started. So just to kick off this session, we're going to start with an audience poll question while we go into some further introductions to get to know our panelists. So we've got that on the screen. Which of these three elements holds the most significance to you and as you're moving through drug development? Time, cost, and quality. So if you want to lock in your answer, and while we're getting the answers in, let's just go around the panel for some intros, as I know each of you work in distinct parts of the business and development stages, different clients. So let's start with you, Matthew. Perhaps just tell us a little bit about your specific role at Cambrex.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'm the CSO of Cambrex, and I'm based in the Boston, Massachusetts site, the Snapdragon Chemistry site. And I really work across the organization's scientific and technical staff to set the agenda for Cambrex's technical roadmap, and then work with business development folks to take projects in, make sure they're getting the right assignment in terms of our resources and capabilities, and then also help explain how we can solve problems that our clients are experiencing in their drug development journey and see how we can help them in that.
Okay, great. Derek, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so I'm Derek Koops. I'm the general manager of the Cambrex site in Longmont, Colorado. We focus here in Colorado on early development, so helping our customers getting into their first IND submission and through that first phase 1 clinical trial. So we can do drug substance development and manufacturing with solid state support work to complement that. Up to the 5 to 10 kilo batch scale. Our largest reactors are about 200 liters, and then we can also do drug product development for formulation development as well as GMP manufacturing to get through that early phase. So really where we are is just coming out of that preclinical space into phase 1 and supporting the IND submissions. And then we typically would hand it over to projects over to Dan's site as they scale up.
Okay, perfect. And Dan?
My name's Dan Bowles. I'm the general manager for the team here in North Carolina, in High Point, North Carolina. As Derek mentioned, we're often kind of in between the smaller, earlier development sites and the larger commercial API sites. So in a way, the Cambrex High Point team is taking generally these phase 2 assets and doing the final process development, the analytical development and validation work, and then commercial readiness, such that compounds could either scale here in our reactors that range from maybe 100 liter up through 2,000 liter. So maybe 100 kilo batches, and helping to bridge into commercial readiness into our larger commercial assets within the Cambrex network.
Okay, great. So now that we've had some time for the audience to make their selections, let's take a look at the results. So we've got time 46%, cost 21%, and quality 33%. So pretty evenly spread, I would say, with time being the most. So I'll move into my first question, and maybe each of you can give your reactions to the poll answers, whether they were surprising, expected. So when you think about moving through drug development, how do you see innovators prioritizing time, cost, and quality based on current market conditions? Derek, let's maybe start with you from early development perspective.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little bit surprised to see that cost came in at number 3 in kind of the current funding environment, where it's a challenging environment to obtain funding. I do feel like the question in some ways was a little bit of a trick question, in the sense that I spent most of my career in project in project management, and you've got that golden triangle between cost, quality, and time, and you really can choose which two that you focus on. You can't have them all three. So I think if we look at our customers and how they're managing, developing their assets in the current market, the ones that we see that are successful kind of do three things. And I think the first thing that the successful ones do is really they're honest about kind of the business objectives that they have, and they know upfront what their goal is. So at one end of the spectrum, we've got customers that kind of are clearly understand that they really want to just get to that next clinical phase as quickly as possible, doing the minimal amount of work in order to invest in that early phase to get their asset to the next phase and to get other rounds of funding. So those customers are not going to spend time scaling up. They're going to stay at the small scale. They're going to make just the amount of material that they need. They're not going to put a lot of effort into product development. They're not going to come up with a complicated dosage form for drug product. And they're really only going to focus on the significant risks that could completely derail their program. Like, so if they know there's a whole bunch of different polymorphs that behave differently, I mean, that would make sense to invest in even in that scenario, but really not to focus on a lot of different scientific curiosity that might derail things. And then other customers at the other end of the spectrum will be putting in a lot more energy up front, which may eventually get them to commercial faster because they will have established a lot more of a track record for the product and remove some risks early on. They'll have scaled up. So I think the important thing is to kind of decide where you are on that spectrum, have a plan, be clear with it, and execute on that. Second thing that successful customers are doing is really working with a fast and flexible product development pipeline. So minimizing the complexity of the product development pipeline that they're working with, and choosing partners that can be fast and flexible and address things that come up in development. Because in early development, things always end up changing that surprise you. So if you've got a partner that has a lot of different capabilities, you may not think you need micronization as an example, but you may come out of your first clinical batch and have a particle size that didn't come out as expected. So having that capability allows the partner to pivot and support your product quickly. And I think the other thing that's really important for success in that fast and flexible pipeline is having network support. So we might be working in the Longmont site and at the 200 liter scale, and then realize, oh, we need a much larger reactor for one of the earlier steps in the synthetic pathway. Then having available partners that could help us support scale up is very helpful. And then I think the third thing that successful customers do is that they really are honest about their timeline. So they set an aggressive but achievable timeline. Where we see people get in trouble is often where they've been too aggressive on the timeline and they get kind of forced into cutting corners that ends up hurting them. So they may have already gone ahead and booked their GLP tox study or their clinical study early on before they even have a synthetic pathway, and then we end up getting pinched to try and come up with a pathway and a synthetic route really quickly. And we get told, okay, well, we don't have time for the demo batch. You have to go straight into GMP manufacturing. That's going to save us time. But the reality is that it doesn't, because you can't pivot quickly as you learn new information in GMP manufacturing and make changes and not slow things down. So it ends up being often slower than it would have been if we had made the demo batch. So I think those are really the three things that successful innovators are doing to kind of manage that cost, timeline, and quality in early development.
Okay, very interesting. And Dan, what's your perspective there?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's interesting. I guess it could have been predicted that all three are very important. Of course, I think I noted that only one vote could be logged per customer. So, of course, all these are very important, and we treat them as such. I think to Derek's point, in an earlier development space, since we're bridging the gap, we need to be flexible and have the ability to handle some of these early tricky items that are on the table. Sometimes when we get a technical process from a client, there are still plenty of gaps, quite frankly. And so we work in a partner space to try to develop alternate chemistry, for example, to a tricky, difficult chemistry problem. Or maybe we recognize that there are going to be significant challenges from an analytical perspective. And so we want to do that with both good speed, but also robustness as this compound starts getting those earlier clinical answers, such that we're prepared to kick off the next GMP campaign. And really, the quality must be weaved in throughout that process. To Derek's point, a lot of times when we're taking processes from the earlier development sites and and staging them here at High Point, essentially in mid-development scale. It's often the first time that we're seeing these compounds manufactured in what we call a traditional pilot plant or production plant setting. There are opportunities to learn, to take those observations and to further improve the process. So we need to be nimble from a clinical perspective, but we need to also look at ways to really make a robust development package such that if and when we get that next clinical milestone, the client is prepared and ready to look for not only next engineering batches, but also to rapidly accelerate into the next phase, which would be the validation, the PPQ batches that sort of support that platform, both from a production, from a manufacturing standpoint, transition into the larger metric ton scale production facilities. And so we do our best to do that in a timely fashion to help both understand what the client needs, but also to prepare customers for some of the challenges and then some of the rewards for upfront investment in some of those activities. So it's a bit of a large swath of activities, but we try to be nimble around that. So time and cost and quality, of course, are all very important there, and we do our best to be flexible once we hear feedback from client as to what's most important for a given point in time.
Okay, great. And Matt, your final thoughts.
Yeah, so building on what Dan said, I think there's this opportunity when they're doing the development of that project into the pilot scale and then thinking about what it's going to look like at manufacturing, to take that advice and invest in understanding the process well enough so that the control strategy is simple. There's specifications that are really workable on raw materials, solvents, and reagents that don't constrain you too much. And that time spent on process development when it's in this mid phase can really save you tremendous amounts of cost at a commercial scale, where you've got a pretty simple control strategy, limited IPCs through the process, and reduce the number of unit operations that are required to make this molecule. That makes for an easier validation, and it makes for a more robust commercial process. So really thinking about that early on when it's in that first pilot plant scale up and it comes out of there and you see where the challenges were, to take the time to address those challenges there so they don't become liabilities at commercialization and costs in commercialization. So that's really important.
Okay. And Matt, have you noticed certain pressures specifically around time constraints when talking about the current geopolitical environment? Has the drive to reshore assets had an impact?
Certainly, because this has all happened pretty rapidly, this change in focus on US and European manufacturing versus traditional, there's certainly been an urgency to get those projects that are in late phase now into US assets and European assets, which is where all of our plants are. So there's been a certain urgency right now to get those late phase projects in, or to take commercial projects and move them in. I imagine, though, that'll become more the standard approach in the future. What we're hearing from large pharma is that their new approach will be to manufacture in country that they sell. So making material in the US for the US, and Europe for Europe, and Asia for Asia. And so as that becomes more of a regular policy within those organizations, I think this urgency to get into US, EU assets will shift to be more of a strategic plan that's executed on a more normal timeline. But for right now, we're busy and timelines are tight.
Yeah. And Dan, as you think about scaling from laboratory scale towards commercial, what are some trends you've noticed as innovators try to move to the next phase without losing time or wasting funds?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's an important one because funding is not always there, but if there is some flexibility around funding, quite often what we're seeing is buying up some of the key activities that we know will be downstream bottlenecks. So, for example, doing some work in parallel, running some engineering batches to shore up some of the technical issues that we've identified up front. More importantly, inviting colleagues from the commercial team to come and witness some of those engineering batches and activities, such that we can streamline the ability to run next process, the validation work in its intended scale. But also a big piece that we've seen, everyone knows that in this day and age that analytical capabilities or more importantly, assets can be a bit of a bottleneck. So Cambrex has worked hard to ensure that we have available resources from a global network perspective to allow us to buy up some of those analytical activities, to do some of the advanced analytical validation work, such that assuming we're planning for success, we've got those activities, those robust methods in place that will allow us to decrease the timeline on the back end to allow us to accelerate into commercial production with a robust analytical platform.
And Derek, let's talk about quality. Is it more than just the table stakes concept of regulatory adherence and patient safety?
I mean, I think the following your procedures, the regulatory compliance, the not jeopardizing patient safety, those things, we need to be making product that can go into humans and be successful in the trial. Those are table stakes. Those are things you can't avoid. But I think where there is flexibility early on in development is how much additional effort in process development and product design in order to investigate some of the challenges that you have with the project that you do early on. So sponsors can either decide to make that investment sooner or make it later. And as you decide to make it later, then it ends up increasing the cost and timeline to get it done. So if you invest that earlier, you can overall save time, but you need to manage obviously the budget that you have within the time frame within the budget you have to get you through that early phase development. So some of the things that customers might want to work on early on in development would be like looking at the different polymorphic forms, the solid state of the material, optimizing the synthesis. I think the last thing we want to do is finish our work here at early phase in Longmont and then be calling up Dan and saying, hey, okay, Dan, we've got this opportunity for you. The customer wants to take this on into phase 2 and use your site. And Dan and his guys are looking at the process and just saying, hey, this is not something that we can work on. So I think we need to be always thinking about what additional effort can be done to support the product and to improve the robustness of the development within the available budget to support the product at that time. And at least making the customer aware of those options so that there's an informed decision that's made and that we don't end up kind of ending up with a big bump in the road when we go to scale up the process to a downstream site. So definitely quality is an absolute, but there is flexibility in terms of how much additional development investment goes into a product.
Okay, great.
More generally, I might note, having a really strong quality organization can save you, time and effort down the road. I mean, that organization is going to make sure that the staff are well trained. They're sharing best practices across all of our manufacturing sites all the time. So, we're getting on top of issues before they even become issues in development. And we've got good, strong partnerships with the quality teams at Innovator to make sure that when we do encounter a deviation or a change, we're able to quickly address that, do a robust investigation, close those CAPAs rapidly, and move the project ahead. So that quality organization that clients are evaluating when they're choosing a GMP manufacturer is really important. The stronger that organization, the smoother a time you're going to have. And that goes all the way from early development through obviously validation and PAI.
Just to further develop on a concept that Derek mentioned, we work very hard as partner sites within the Cambrex network to ensure that we have good understanding at what the next receiving site can accept, what's robust for them, what's a no-go for them. There are obviously going to be continued challenges through the development cycle, but the earlier we check each of those boxes and knock those punch list items off, then theoretically it can go to any site within the Cambrex network. And we have lots of good examples, case studies of programs that sometimes go to an earlier development site just to knock out another quick tox batch, right? I mean, it can go backwards. It doesn't always have to graduate into the larger sites. And, if there are changes made to a process such that it's suddenly inflexible for one of these other sites, that's a no-go for Cambrex. And so since we've recognized very early on, we need to have that ultimate flexibility across our global network. We work hard on the front end to make sure that there are no roadblocks left when we get through some of these development cycles.
Okay, great. I wanted to get into some sort of practical sort of case studies. Just wondering, do each of you have examples of how you either separately or as a network of sites have helped keep projects moving within certain time or cost constraints? Matt, maybe you want to start with this one.
Yeah, certainly. One that comes to mind almost immediately is we had a project come in as a commercializing molecule in our Sweden plant, and it was about to move into manufacturing when the innovator got some new tox data. And what we thought was a not terribly toxic molecule turned out to be a highly potent API. And so at a last minute, we had to pivot a step of that from our Sweden site all the way over to Charles City, Iowa, where we can do high potent compounds. And so now that site's co-developing it with the Sweden site. Really took a collaborative effort to transfer that process mid-phase, middle of development when this new information came forward from the client. And that kind of flexibility only comes from an organization that's constantly working together as a team. And I think what you'll hear from some of the other examples that are provided is that's really key to what Cambrex is able to offer. Is you don't get just one site or one team when you come to Cambrex. You've got the entire organization. We've worked with Dan's team from Snapdragon and from Milan to move projects forward. We work with Derek's team to move molecules from there to larger scale all the time. So that collaboration is constantly going on. I mean, I see these guys weekly nearly. So, it's a constant conversation that keeps projects moving for clients.
Okay, Dan?
Yeah, thanks. I think there are lots of good examples out there, and certainly one that comes to mind as a more recent example. Frankly, we had just been following this compound from a kind of a mid-development perspective, but it was a compound that was set to undergo full stage validation and filing support in our Charles City assets. And there was a late change to the process, but there was also a bit of a challenge from a technical perspective with the step 1 out of 4 hydrogenation capability there. And we were seeing some results that weren't necessarily going to allow us to move forward in a timely fashion. And that affected, of course, all the downstream activities. And that created panic, both from a client side, but also a production side. And so Cambrex, in a very quick fashion, we've flexibly applied different resources, and namely we moved that step 1 validation here back to High Point. I mentioned that before. Sometimes things can move in different directions, but that hydrogenation from receipt of the tech pack to the initial pilot studies and then moving on to the validation work, that all happened within about a month, which is pretty remarkable from a timescale perspective. And so High Point team, of course, we had to rearrange some capacity, but we do strive to have that nimble approach. But in short, what I will say is that validation came to High Point, and within that month, we were kicked off and running. We produced those 4 step 1 batches very successfully, and we were constantly updating the team and the network and feeding those batches back to Charles City for the step 2 of that validation downstream. And I look at that as a flexible application of resources. We don't always have the available capacity, but if we maintain that nimble approach and that network help and support as general practice, then we can kind of make some really good things happen. In that case, the client timeline really wasn't affected nearly as badly as it could have been. They expect to complete their filing in the end of this year, which is fantastic. So I'd call that a big success story for a big pharma client.
Yeah, definitely. The importance of being nimble. Derek, do you have any case studies to share?
Yeah, I think so. What we're seeing with some of our customers is that they're finding that their chances of success for their molecules are higher. They're willing to invest more early on and kind of scale up even in that pre-IND submission stage. They're looking for kind of larger batch sizes in the 20-ish kilo range, as opposed to normally we would have been more in kind of that 1 to 5 range. So the way we've been addressing that is really kind of leveraging the power of our network. So we will start here. We'll do the process development and process chemistry here and look at making that initial clinical deliverable at kind of that 1 to 5 or maybe a little bit larger scale to get the clinic going. But in parallel to us working on those activities, we'll be partnered with the process chemists and the development team at High Point, and in High Point, in kind of rapid succession to us manufacturing our smaller scale batch here, they'll be working on scaling into the larger scale so that we can kind of do both for the customer, give them that kind of immediate deliverable to get their IND filed and get the product on the project on track, but then also have quickly available the larger quantity of material in order to keep developing the product and moving it forward. So that's really what we've been working on here.
And I would add to that, I think that's probably one of the better improvements we have from a network perspective, is kind of taking that stage gate approach, looking for that positive data from the early clinical batches in Longmont, but also taking a bit of a risk, being willing to go on a bit of a limb, but also having that very good technical contact between our technical teams. The process chemists, the analysts are going back and forth, sometimes physically, but often on daily meetings, really just to ensure that we have a good dovetail of resources between the sites. And to Derek's point, quite often it's a strategic decision to go ahead and do batches in parallel. But so long as we are taking a really good hard look at what are the key critical parameters for that scale up, we can often scale up in parallel, or more often maybe lockstep, one step behind. And that approach allows us to accelerate that next batch at risk, but also at opportunity. And I think that gives us a chance to help accelerate development timelines. I think more often than not, we're hearing in this kind of mid-development space that some compounds, especially in the cancer portfolio, are being approved really a lot quicker. The timelines are accelerated, and so that gives us a chance to do some of these early tox work batches, but also moving us into kind of the next phase of development, the next clinical phase, to allow clients to move forward more aggressively.
I mean, I would also note that we're also looking at, in this mid-phase to commercialization, leveraging our analytical expertise at a Durham site to centralize the RSM release methods and the API release methods and stability storage and reference standard management, such that even if the project moves from High Point up to Charles City for scale up, for much larger scale, we're able to avoid a transfer of those technical analytical methods and really save cost and time in doing that, being able to keep those centralized at one location, both serving High Point and Charles City as the analytical release center for that molecule and the stability center. So that can really save time and effort for these rapidly advancing projects that might get a priority from the agency for marketing because of an unmet medical need. And the other way we use our network is to de-risk programs for clients. We have a few examples in our network where there's really complex RSMs that were single sourced within for the client, where they wanted to de-risk that. We were able to do that by internalizing that RSM manufacturer in our Milan or Karlskoga, Sweden facility, so that we can make that RSM there and then either ship that to High Point for some of the small volume commercial projects, or to Charles City for some of the larger volume commercial projects. And in that way, de-risk it and be able to help them manage that timeline for receiving what can be some really long lead time items from single suppliers. So that's another way that we try to use this network. And then I think I'd also mention we're able to maintain some specialties within the network that all of us draw on, and that could be in terms of process development for really challenging chemistries that require flow chemistry, and Dan's engineering group and the group here at Snapdragon collaborating to develop flow processes that might end up in our manufacturing plants. Biocatalysis expertise that we maintain at our Wiesbaden site in Germany, really 25 years of expertise that we can bring to bear on chemical transformations. And then in our Edinburgh site, a really talented team in solid state characterization, crystallization development that can be leveraged by the entire organization to solve solid form problems, identify crystalline forms of challenging to crystallize molecules, and really help programs move in parallel. that work's going on while we're doing development work for the synthetic steps at another site. And so really working together to support that project from all aspects, things like nitrosamine testing, PGTI testing down at Durham as well, going on in parallel while we're going through process development and manufacture at another site.
I would echo that, Matt, and I think that's one of the key assets that we can offer from a network perspective within the Cambrex network, that it frankly makes it easy for us to do our work here in High Point, that we can focus on the process development piece, the analytical piece, the engineering assets here that we handle locally, but also to call on the network to handle things that maybe aren't exactly within the High Point wheelhouse. So you mentioned the team at Wiesbaden. If we've got a potential enzymatic process, we're absolutely happy to call on those experts to contribute possible alternate chemistry or the final form. Maybe there are polymorph concerns or some of the robustness concerns around that final crystallization and isolation. The team in Edinburgh has helped us countless times to develop a process that is just really robust that we can drop back into our final form isolation here. So the teams at the early development sites certainly have helped us quite a bit with analytical overflow capacity. Sometimes if our local resources are temporarily at their max, we often call in resources from other sites. And most importantly, I think from a client perspective, is that these are all handled at an FTE basis. So really, you're just purchasing one package of FTE within the Cambrex network at whatever site you're working with. But we, as that site, will call on these other sites, decreasing the burden for the client. So you should feel like you're just working with one site. That's our hope. You should feel that you're working with one Cambrex location, and we handle the dirty work behind the scenes. That's how it should feel.
Okay, I'm just going to pause and just ask the audience. If you have any questions, don't forget to hit the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. For any question, I do see a few that have come through, and we'll have some time at the end to go through them. So back to the panelists. My next question is, what are you all seeing in the market that is making a difference in how pharmaceutical companies select CDMO partners? Dan, maybe we'll start with you, with the bigger companies.
Yeah, you've hit on one right off the front, and that was the onshoring trend. Of course, no one can predict what the market will bear, but we've been seeing a lot of compounds coming back from abroad, and that's both good. It's also challenging to Matt's perspective. We haven't stopped hopping, and it's a good thing. We're seeing a lot of new chemistry, a lot of challenging chemistry. Quite often, we're seeing opportunities to take processes that have been scaled successfully abroad, but de-risking that by bringing it back stateside or to Europe. And I think that's been a benefit. It's a bit of a market shift, but one that we're prepared for. We've certainly been investing in capacity across all of our sites and network, and we do have the ability to take those compounds on. I'd say that's probably the biggest shift we've had.
Derek, what about you?
Yeah, I think the major kind of new shift we've been seeing is that desire by some of our customers to scale up and invest more in their early development assets sooner. That's some customers definitely are taking that new approach. Many are still kind of really just trying to get their asset to the next clinical phase as quickly as possible, as has really not changed over the past large number of years. So we're seeing a little bit of kind of both dynamics play out at once, depending on the profile of the customer that we're working with.
And Matt?
Yeah, I think with some of the large innovators, we're seeing a desire to centralize their portfolio with just a handful of CDMOs. And so having the technical breadth to go after what is in some cases a very diverse portfolio of multiple modalities, different synthetic modalities that are being advanced. So we've invested a lot in technologies that we think are important to the portfolios we're seeing, things like liquid phase peptide synthesis to augment our abilities in synthetic and to be able to leverage actually all 1.4 million liters of capacity that we have to do things like small molecule manufacture one day and then peptide manufacture the next day in the same assets. So that's been really important. And I think the breadth of capabilities from that to complex synthetics to solid state characterization to the small molecule expertise is really important to have all under one roof of synthetic expertise, because it really addresses the large, diverse portfolios that we're seeing at large pharma.
Okay, and go on.
Sorry, I was just going to add, so Matt made me think of something that, from our perspective, our ability to be flexible in chemistries. So Matt, of course, has a strong background and focus on continuous flow API manufacture. We have the same here in High Point, and so that's been a great relationship. But not only looking to find assets that need continuous flow manufacture, but sometimes just as a practical alternative to that one particular tricky batch step. And so having that flexibility across the network, having the experts that can apply that and shift gears, and then move right back into traditional batch mode manufacture has been another bit of a trend we've seen. Clients will often bring us a process that looks really good overall, but maybe has that one tricky step that could benefit from a little bit of alternate batch mode technology into continuous flow. So we apply that. We apply those learnings from previous chemistries, previous past projects, and look for ways to accelerate those programs, again, past that problematic point into a point of opportunity.
Okay, and finally, I want to talk about sustainability. It's a very hot topic these days, and essential to a lot of companies working with CDMOs. Matt, how do you address the need for sustainable manufacturing without losing sight of other key drivers?
Yeah, there's a couple components to this. One of them is the way we operate our plants and how sustainable that is in general. And then there's the actual processes that we run in those plants and how sustainable are those. So on the sustainability of our plants and operations in particular, I would note that, we've been constantly reducing our carbon footprint. We've now submitted our science-based targets initiatives. Those have been validated and published now to reduce our scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions significantly by 2030. We're almost 100% electricity renewable at our Charles City, Iowa plant. That'll be 100% by next year. And our Milan plant as well is moving from what was a rather low number in renewable electricity to 100% next year. So we're really excited about those opportunities. And then the people that we obtain raw materials from, solvents and reagents and things, we're constantly going back to them and challenging their sustainability as well. How sustainable are they in what they're manufacturing for us, so that when you do come to us, we've already got that data, we've already got that plan to address sustainability. But then in the actual projects as well, there's an opportunity for sustainability to build in. And what we used to see is that was a life cycle management. We'll deal with that post-launch and we'll build sustainability as part of continuous improvement. What we're seeing now is really a shift to sustainability being built in as part of the selection of the commercial route. So what is the process mass intensity of that route being a question? What solvents are being chosen? Are we using precious metal catalysts? Can we substitute those for biocatalysis like Dan mentioned, or a non-precious metal catalyst? And then actually looking at the way we're doing the control strategy. If we're thinking that in the future we might want to recycle solvent if we get to a certain level of utilization in the future, we might want to build in a broader specification for that solvent purity than you would have normally if you were just going to assume that you're going to buy solvent off the shelf all the time. So doing that during development and filing a package that says, yeah, I can use acetonitrile that's 95% with some water in it for this step, means that when we do get to the point where it's a huge volume project and we want to impose some solvent recycle for sustainability and things like that, we've got the window to do that without having to make a change, which is a real cost and time saver for the client. It means they can go ahead and execute that solvent recycle without having to do any changes post-launch. So thinking ahead now is really part of the sustainability plan. How can I build sustainability into my process such that if it does achieve that huge market uptake that we'd love to see, how can I make sure that I'm doing it with the lowest carbon footprint imaginable? So now, where Dan's doing development on these processes, those things are top of mind.
Mhm. Any other thoughts on sustainability?
Yeah, I think I would dovetail into that. I mean, to Matt's point, looking at the carbon footprint, the sustainability from that perspective, that's a huge piece. Of course, we have commitment to focus of our health and safety of our workers, but also just a general commitment that I've seen and appreciated is a general commitment to sustaining the environment and reducing waste on the front side. So, to Matt's point, it's refreshing when clients ask us to take a look at lowering solvent volumes, increasing throughput, reducing the toxicity of our waste in general. And yes, looking at recycling, upcycling of any recovered intermediates or solvents. I think we all have it as a responsibility of scientists to do good science, both for the development and furthering of a project, but also doing it in a responsible way. And I think Cambrex has done a great job of ensuring that our scientists are thinking that way, that are trained that way, and looking for opportunities to improve going forward.
Derek, what about the earlier stage development?
I think for us with the smaller footprint, we certainly make less contributions in terms of the overall emissions, but we can develop processes and use formulations and materials with sustainability in mind. I think we actually also benefit just from focusing on our own utility utilization by thinking about, could we change how we're using that HVAC system, set up some different controls, and we've had some projects we've gotten through where we've ended up saving some of our energy consumption just by changing the way we were using some of our existing systems. So it's definitely still a focus as a result of the priority within the company, but I would say definitely being at the small scale, we really move the needle a lot less than the larger sites.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I think we're now moving on to the Q&A portion of the panel. Just a reminder to the audience, you still have some time to submit questions, so please do that by hitting the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. But let's get started with the first one. So what are some considerations I should keep in mind when trying to shorten my timelines from preclinical to phase 1 without adding too much risk to my program? If anyone wants to take the first one.
Yeah, I think the important thing really is when you're really to be honest with yourself, when you're setting up your program, think about the known risks that you have for your product that you need to mitigate in development, and think about what your business goals are for the project. Like, is your goal to come up with a product that's fully fleshed out at the time you filed your IND and you're entering into phase 1, or are you really just trying to get to that next phase? And be kind of honest in terms of what your goals are, so that you have clearly defined objectives that you're working towards, because it's really important to end up with timelines that are aggressive but achievable. Where I see people getting into trouble is where they end up with timelines that are set up that just are not achievable. And the only way that you can possibly hit the timeline is by cutting steps that are necessary. And that's where people end up getting in trouble. So it's really spending time coming up with clearly defined goals and objectives for the projects, and then having a timeline that's aggressive but achievable that aligns with those is what I'm seeing.
I think from our perspective, as we take those assets that have been demonstrated by Derek's team and bringing them into kind of a later stage development cycle, one of the keys is making sure that we didn't hem ourselves in too tightly in terms of toxicity, in terms of control of critical impurities, that kind of thing. So leaving ourselves a bit of flexibility. The most obvious example is don't purify by chromatography in early development, else it's hard to replicate that purity profile when we're scaling things up. Everyone knows that example, but it's more than that, right? It's understanding that as we take the good process that Derek's team has developed and look to further streamline or increase throughput or increase efficiency, that we don't change the toxicity profile. So thinking about those things on the front end, Derek's team is doing a nice job of giving us processes that we have flexible parameters to allow us to put it in our plant. And then we turn in lockstep and do the same thing with the larger commercial facilities, such that we're not rebuilding or revamping a process at each stage of development as it goes from one asset to another. And that's something that we've worked hard as a global network development team to make sure that we're not surprising the receiving technical team as assets move and migrate through the development pathway. And that starts from an early development perspective, just having that approach, having that mentality. And I think that's important.
Okay, the next question is, what trends have you seen with AI impacting efficiency in the pharmaceutical space?
Yeah, so if we look at areas like process development, I think where we're looking at using it is in getting to the right answer quicker. So if you can, our group in Milan has been working on a system that's able to predict the right LC conditions for a new molecule based on previous history of molecules. So being able to use structure and other parameters of that molecule to predict what's the best starting point for me developing an HPLC method. And that's an example where we can very quickly get to a starting point for analytical method development based on a large historic database of compounds that had all their properties characterized. We're now moving to do something similar in the liquid phase peptide synthesis in terms of peptide crystallization. So our group in Edinburgh has been working on peptide crystallization for a few years now. They're developing a database of molecules that are structure-based in terms of the sequence and likelihood of crystallization. We're doing something similar when we want to keep a molecule in solution. So looking at aggregation potential based on sequence and being able to be predictive there. Then we're also using it in areas that used to be really time-consuming workflows. So gathering the annual report data for a product by combing through all the batch records and pulling out the trends and mapping that all manually. That now can be read by an AI. All that data can be extracted, put into tables, and then we can start to look for trends in that or have it look for trends in that. And that's something that we've piloted at our Charles City site, at our Karlskoga site, and also in Milan. We're also able to use it for that first pass of, does this batch record have any errors that we need to look at or address by having it look at exceptions where it expected something and something's not there. So really being able to be on top of the batch record as it's being completed so that we catch anything that might be a deviation or a gap in the recording immediately and can deal with it in that moment. And then, just applying it to some of the normal workflows that go along with really paper-intensive transfers from one system to another. We can automate that so that those transfers take place much faster. But I think the thing that I'm really excited about is these predictive tools that we're developing in process development to get us to the right answer and a good answer for manufacture faster than we could have gotten there on our own. And we're building those databases around high throughput experimentation on catalysts, on this crystallization screening, on the analytical side as well. So I think what you'll see over the next few years is that getting to that starting point of this is a commercializable process, this is a commercializable analytical method, can be validated, will be much faster. And then from there, being able to characterize that process with much more data analysis than I think you've seen previously, because we're able to take in much larger amounts of data and analyze it quickly. So those are the things I'm really excited about for the next coming years.
Yeah. And obviously things have changed drastically, in the last couple of years. Have you noticed anything to be like problematic where, you really need to apply some vigilance there to ensure that, it's not getting ahead of you?
Yeah, certainly it's been a learning experience, how to prompt these things properly if you're using a large language model, how to build a database of structural and molecule characteristics such that you can leverage it for AI in itself has been a challenge that we're working through. So I think we're still learning how to talk to these tools, to leverage these tools. Some of them are simple algorithms that are not AI at all, and then others are at the other extreme where they're actually these Bayesian optimizers that are using large training sets to arrive at a predictive capability. So, and the challenges with each change quite a bit as you go from one type of AI or machine learning to another. And so I think navigating that has been a journey that we've been on for a number of years now. And we're starting to actually see the fruits of that in being able to use these tools in our everyday work.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, next question is, how does Cambrex address the tech transfer process between sites to keep projects moving well for clients?
Yeah, I mean, Dan gave a great example of this early on, and I just build on that. I mean, we've had teams sitting together all the time looking at best practices in tech transfer. Our engineering forum meets monthly to discuss, what they're seeing in tech transfer and to learn from that. But the example that Dan gave is really the fruit of all of that labor in getting the teams working together over the years, such that when we do have a problem, that tech transfer is nearly seamless. I mean, I couldn't imagine that hydrogenation fix being done any faster than if it had happened at the same site. If somehow all magically the tools were all at the same site, it couldn't have happened faster. And yet here they are separated by 2,000 miles. Maybe build on that, Dan.
Yeah, I think that was probably a best case scenario. I think things can take longer at times, but what it is a commitment in the underlying background that we understand that clients are under tremendous pressures. You've laid out that timeline to your filing and stepping back from that to even the FIH submission. All these things are critical and strategic, and none of us want to be the reason that we have delays to those. And so we recognized that very on from a Cambrex network perspective that we were going to have to be very efficient. In fact, sometimes too efficient at ensuring that all receiving teams and donating teams are on the same page. And so more often than not, we will be proactive about bringing scientists from one site to another to witness firsthand some of the key critical attributes of a given process. I mentioned before, quite often, High Point or Longmont might be the first time that a client is seeing their process scaled up to any reasonable, appreciable scale beyond the lab. And I think it's important to both take the time to come and witness that, but also to understand what you're seeing, and more importantly, see things that will be a challenge or a roadblock as we start to model a process for commercial, for metric ton quantity production. Sometimes you can take that time and do additional development. Sometimes you've got to be very strategic about what you can change and what you're going to have to save for later based on either funding or timing or quality. And I think that's something that we've worked very hard at doing. We know that we're not all based at one site. We can't just walk down the hall. And so to Matt's example, the one that we talked about before, having the nimble flexibility and a commitment to overcome those challenges is much more important than actually being co-located, I think.
Yeah, and I think definitely like building those human networks between the scientists so that you can build that trust and that ability to collaborate has really been fundamental to being successful at those tech transfers. And Matt mentioned about the TT forums and the scientific forums that we have regularly, but another thing that I think Matt started when he joined recently was Science Day. So we've got most companies will have a sales meeting where all the salespeople will get together at a location and get to know one another and team build. But the direction we've taken is to focus on Science Day, where we're sending the scientists from each of the sites to talk about the work that they've worked on, share some of the excitement, and really get to know one another, so that when there's a project that's coming from that scientist to your site, that you really trust the quality of the work that's been done and already know one another. So it's just that much easier to work together. So that's been a focus.
Okay, the next question is, how do supply chain security concerns play into how you as a CDMO work to advance programs efficiently? Are there steps you take to help clients?
Yeah, as I mentioned, in some cases we've gone all the way to internalizing some of those processes for critical raw materials that there was a supply chain concern. But more broadly, we're constantly looking at our supply chain and making sure that we're multi-sourced, multi-vendor sourced for any items that we use regularly, and that we've developed long histories with those partners, so that we understand if there's a bottleneck there or if it's coming, we can shift. We know who to go to for that. They're already qualified. We can get the materials in hand right away. But I think that the greatest opportunity that we've had is to really partner with them on critical raw materials, and where need be, bring them in or at least do process development on them and then take them back out such that they're de-risked in terms of being able to be manufactured at multiple third-party organizations that are able to supply those. So that would be the example I'd point to in terms of the de-risking programs from an RSM perspective. Certainly, there's some other perspectives where we're de-risking programs, and some of that is the analytical depth of the network, being able to leverage a very large analytical team at our Durham site to support all the organization and really understanding that. We're able to leverage a group that we have in Talon for doing our cleaning validation and really have that flexibility with analytical in particular, which is really critical to move that where capacity needs are called out. So we're able to move it very quickly and get on those and develop methods and leverage the expertise of the organization there.
Any other thoughts on supply chain security concerns?
Yeah, I was just being conscious of time, but yeah, I think Matt hit it right on the head, and it's kind of taking that de-risking approach and looking at multiple avenues to a key or critical raw material. The supply chain, we recognize for continuity, we can't afford to not be able to secure some of those key intermediates, and so bringing a lot of that internally, as Matt mentioned, but also continually looking for updating our vendor supply list is another key activity. We also leverage multiple assets across the organization in terms of some have different expertise in different markets. And so we certainly leverage that to make sure that we have good continuity of supply.
Okay, great. And the final question that we have coming through is, what are some manufacturing technologies that are gaining traction to help speed time to market?
I would say with some of the complex synthetics, we've seen membrane technologies for separations become really important. So being able to separate molecules based on molecular weight through nanofiltration or traditional tangential flow filtration, but with organic solvents instead of just aqueous systems. It's been a really interesting technology to see evolve into the synthetic space, where it was traditionally only on the biologic side. We're now seeing many examples where we're able to leverage that for achieving high purity in some of these complex synthetic molecules that may not lend themselves to crystallization. That would be one area that I'd certainly point to. Obviously, continuous manufacturing continues to be important and an enabling technology. Things like photochemistry, electrochemistry, and these cryogenic lithiations and things like that. So those are some of the key technologies I'd point to, in addition to biocatalysis, which we mentioned before.
I think I would add. Sorry, go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, I mean, I've been in the industry quite a while, so early on, everything was very manual. But I think one of the things that really has struck me is some of the advances with the LabOS operating system that you've come up with at Snapdragon, which allows us to do kind of design of experiments and have the machine collect some of the data online, so that we can really more rapidly generate some of that process understanding that before would have been an extremely manual exercise for multiple chemists taking a lot of different samples. So I think that's something that we're seeing a lot of traction with as well.
And the only other point I would add is just some of the technologies that we've been utilizing in the lab. They've always been around, but we use them strategically to our advantage. A good example is the EasyMax platform that allows us to get both consistent data from site to site based on that technology, but also gathering some of the calorimetry data so that we don't have to repeat experiments as we head into larger development and preparation for scale. We can call back that data and recognize any key or critical trends that we need to follow up on. So that's definitely accelerating the development pathway. And it's old existing technology, but it continues to be very good and consistent across the sites.
Okay, great. Well, that brings us to the end of the session. Thanks to all of our panelists for all of their insight and expertise. Super insightful as well with some of those case studies. And thanks to all of you in the audience for participating. And finally, thanks to Cambrex for sponsoring the session. A reminder that this webinar will be available tomorrow to rewatch or to share with colleagues. But for now, I'm Surani Fernando, and we hope to see you again at a future Endpoints webinar. Thanks, everyone.